They laughed at the old man's gift, said it wasn't worth the dust on their boots. But by sunrise, those same men would stand a little farther back when they passed his gate. The sound of it still hung in the air, dry and sharp like gravel under a wagon wheel, echoing out from the saloon porch where 3 men leaned against the railing, hats tipped low, eyes narrow with the kind of amusement that came easy when the sun was high and the world felt simple. Elias Boone didn't look at them. He just bent slowly, joints stiff from years of weather and work, and picked up the small cloth bundle that had slipped from his hands and fallen into the dirt. Dust clung to it, fine and pale, the same color as the road stretching out past the town, the same color as the land that had taken more from him than it had ever given back. He brushed it off with care, not hurried, not ashamed, just steady, like a man who understood the value of small things long after others had forgotten. Inside that bundle were a few pieces of hard bread, a strip of dried meat, and a tin cup wrapped in a faded handkerchief stitched with initials that no one in town remembered anymore. The cloth was worn thin, edges soft from years of folding and unfolding, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with what it held. One of the men laughed again, louder this time, nudging the other with his elbow. "You feeding ghosts now, old man?" he called out, voice carrying across the quiet street. Elias didn't answer. He had learned a long time ago that not every voice deserved one. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze drifting past the men, past the wooden posts and hitching rails, to where the road curved toward the dry hills beyond town. That's where he saw her. She stood near the edge of the road, still as a fence post, wrapped in shadows cast by the late afternoon sun. Her dress was worn, her posture guarded, and though she didn't move, there was something in the way she held herself that spoke louder than any plea. People in town didn't need to be told who she was. They saw the same thing Elias saw, the difference in her skin, the quiet in her eyes, and they turned away before understanding had a chance to settle in. Elias shifted the bundle in his hands, then started walking, boots pressing softly into the dirt with each measured step. The laughter behind him faded, replaced by the creak of wood, the distant clink of glass, and the low whistle of wind slipping between buildings. He stopped a few feet from her, not too close, not too far, leaving space the way a man does when he knows the cost of taking it without asking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath between them, balanced on something fragile and unseen. Then Elias lowered the bundle slightly, offering it forward without a word. The girl hesitated. Her eyes flickered to his hands, then to his face, searching for something that wasn't easy to name. Suspicion, maybe, or the absence of it. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and took the bundle, her fingers brushing the edge of the cloth as if testing whether it was real. Elias gave a small nod, nothing more, and stepped back. No explanations, no questions, just the quiet understanding that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant smoke, rustling the loose threads of the handkerchief now held in her hands. For a brief second, her grip tightened, as though she recognized something in it. Not the food, not the cup, but the care and how it had been given. Elias turned then, heading back toward the edge of town, his figure small against the wide stretch of land waiting beyond. Behind him, the girl remained where she stood, watching, the bundle held close. And somewhere far off, beyond the low hills and fading light, something unseen had already begun to move. The sun dropped low behind the ridge, stretching long shadows across the town as Elias Boone walked the slow road back to his ranch, each step measured, each breath steady, like a man who had learned to carry silence the way others carried pride. The land opened wide around him, dry grass whispering under the evening wind, fence posts leaning like old men who had seen too many seasons come and go. His ranch sat a mile outside town, small and worn, the wood faded to a gray that matched the sky before a storm. Nothing about it called for attention, and that was the way Elias preferred it. He pushed open the gate with a soft creak, the hinges complaining in a voice older than most men still living in that town, and let it swing closed behind him without looking back. Inside, the yard was quiet. A water trough half full, a saddle resting on a rail, a single lantern hanging by the door waiting for night to claim the land. Elias paused there for a moment, his hand resting against the wood of the fence, feeling the warmth the sun had left behind. It would not last. Nothing ever did out here. He moved toward the porch, boots tapping lightly against the hard-packed dirt, and reached for the door just as his horse shifted in the small corral nearby, ears flicking toward the hills. Elias stopped, not because of the movement, but because of what came with it. A stillness, the kind that did not belong to empty land. He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the distant ridge where the last light of day clung to the horizon. There was nothing there. No riders. No dust. Just the outline of rock and sky. But the feeling stayed, settling somewhere deep in his chest where instincts lived longer than reason. He stood there for a breath, maybe two, then shook it off and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of wood and time, of things kept longer than they should have been because there was no one left to say otherwise. He lit the lantern, the flame catching slow and steady, casting a warm glow that pushed the darkness back just enough to make the room feel smaller than it was. On the table near the window sat a folded piece of cloth, similar to the one he had given away. Only this one remained untouched, preserved. Elias reached for it, fingers brushing the edge before he stopped himself, letting his hand fall away. Some things were better left where they were. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the walls, carrying with it the faintest sound. Not loud, not clear, just enough to be noticed. Elias moved back to the door and opened it slightly, letting the cool air slip in. He listened. At first, there was nothing but the usual sounds of night settling in. Then, faint and distant, the rhythm came. Slow, measured, like something moving across the land with purpose. Not one, more than one. He closed the door gently, not in fear, but in understanding that whatever was out there did not belong to him to interrupt. Instead, he stepped back, set the lantern on the table, and sat down in the chair by the window. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not bar the door. He simply waited. The night stretched long, the kind that seemed to hold more than darkness, as if the land itself was watching, holding its breath the way it had earlier that day. Hours passed without shape or measure, the lantern burning low, shadows shifting along the walls like quiet thoughts that refused to settle. And then, just before the sky began to change, just before the first line of dawn touched the edge of the world, Elias opened his eyes. He had not realized he had closed them. The silence had changed again. This time, it was heavier. Full. He stood slowly, joints stiff, and walked to the door. When he opened it, the air felt different. Still, but not empty. The light was just beginning to rise, pale and thin across the horizon, revealing shapes where there had been none before. At first, his eyes did not understand what they were seeing. Then they did. Figures. Standing. Not close. Not far. Just beyond the fence line, spaced evenly across the front of his land like posts driven into the earth with careful intent. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply stood, facing outward, toward the open land, as if watching something only they could see. Elias stepped forward onto the porch, the wood creaking softly under his weight, his breath slow, his gaze steady. He counted without meaning to. 10, 20, more beyond that. The early light caught on the edges of them, revealing details one piece at a time. Feathers, leather, faces calm and unreadable. And among them, near the gate he had passed through the evening before, stood the girl. The bundle was gone from her hands, but the cloth remained, now tied carefully at her wrist, the faded stitching visible even in the weak morning light. She did not look at him right away. When she did, it was brief. A single glance. Enough to say what words never could. Then her eyes returned to the horizon, the same as the others. Watching, guarding, waiting. And for the first time in years, the land around Elias Boone did not feel empty. The light grew stronger by the minute, turning the pale outline of dawn into something solid, something real, and with it came the quiet understanding that what stood beyond Elias Boone's fence was no illusion born from a tired mind or a long night. They were still there, every one of them, not shifting, not restless, not speaking, just present in a way that filled the land without disturbing it. Elias rested his hand on the porch railing, the wood rough beneath his palm, grounding him in the moment as his eyes moved slowly across the line of figures. There was no anger in their stance, no urgency, no demand. Only a stillness that carried purpose, The kind a man could feel without needing it explained. The girl remained near the gate, the faded cloth tied at her wrist catching the early sunlight as it crept higher over the hills. It looked different now, no longer just worn fabric, but something acknowledged, something seen. Elias stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the dirt with a soft crunch, and walked a few paces forward, stopping well before the fence. He did not cross it. He did not call out. Some lines were better left where they were, even when no one had drawn them. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, from somewhere along the line, one of the men shifted his stance, just slightly, enough to break the perfect stillness without disturbing it. Another followed. Not toward Elias, not away from him, just a subtle adjustment, like men settling into a position they intended to hold for a long time. Elias exhaled slowly, the sound barely more than a breath, and nodded once, not as a command, not as a question, but as recognition. Behind him, far off in the direction of town, a faint shape moved along the road. Dust rose first, thin and uncertain. Then the outline of riders began to form, small against the wide stretch of land, but growing clearer with each passing second. Elias did not need to turn to know who they were. Word traveled fast in places like that. Faster than truth sometimes. The laughter from the day before had not stayed behind with the setting sun. It had followed him out here, carried by curiosity, by doubt, by the simple need to see what a man like him could not possibly have done. The riders approached at a cautious pace, slowing as the figures by the fence came into full view. Horses shifted, uncertain, their ears flicking, picking up on something their riders had not yet put into words. The men from town stopped a good distance away, not close enough to challenge, not far enough to pretend they had not come. One of them leaned forward in the saddle, squinting toward the line of warriors, then toward Elias, as if trying to fit both into the same understanding and failing. No one called out. No one made a move to close the distance. The space between them held, wide and deliberate, like a boundary drawn without chalk or rope. Elias remained where he stood, neither stepping back nor forward, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady. He did not look at the men from town right away. Instead, his eyes returned to the girl. She noticed. Of course she did. She stepped forward just enough to place herself fully within the light, the cloth at her wrist shifting with the movement. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that small gesture. She raised her hand slightly, not high, not dramatic, just enough to reveal the stitching more clearly, the faded initials catching the morning sun. Elias felt something settle in his chest, something that had been restless for longer than he cared to admit. Not relief, not pride, something quieter, something that did not need a name. Behind the girl, the line of warriors remained unchanged, their attention fixed outward, not on the ranch, not on the man who owned it, but on everything beyond it, as if the land itself had been given a boundary and they had chosen to stand at its edge. The men from town shifted in their saddles again, unease replacing whatever curiosity had brought them out here. One of them removed his hat, not out of habit, not out of heat, but as if something in the air had asked it of him without words. Another glanced sideways, then back toward the road, already measuring the distance it would take to leave. Elias finally turned his head slightly in their direction, not fully, just enough to acknowledge their presence. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not feel smaller than what already stood between them. The wind moved gently across the open land, brushing past the fence, through the line of silent figures, carrying with it the scent of dust and morning. And in that quiet, something shifted that no one would ever put into words. The laughter from the day before had nowhere to stand anymore. It had been left behind, somewhere between the saloon porch and the rising sun, replaced by something heavier, something that asked for silence and received it without resistance. Elias Boone stood there a while longer, not counting time, not waiting for anything to end, because for the first time in years, nothing needed to be proven and nothing needed to be said. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the pale morning haze, and still the line did not break. They held their places with a patience that did not ask for recognition, as if time itself moved around them instead of through them. Elias Boone shifted his weight slightly, the old wood of the porch steps behind him creaking faintly in memory, though he no longer stood there. Out here, a few yards from his fence, the ground felt different under his boots, steadier somehow, as though it understood what was happening even if he did not fully. The men from town lingered where they had stopped, their horses restless in small ways, hooves nudging the dirt, tails flicking at nothing, sensing the quiet tension that their riders could not quite name. One of them cleared his throat, the sound thin against the wide openness, but no one answered it. Words did not belong here. Not yet. Elias let his gaze move once more along the line, taking in the details he had missed before. The way each man stood not in perfect uniform, but in quiet agreement. The slight turn of a shoulder, the angle of a chin, the way their eyes stayed fixed outward, not on him, not on the town, but on the land that stretched beyond both. This was not a gathering. It was a choice. And choices like that did not happen without reason. His eyes found the girl again. Iona. He did not know her name, but he felt it now in the way she carried herself, in the calm certainty that had replaced the guarded stillness from the day before. She took a step forward, just one, and this time when she looked at him, she did not look away quickly. The silence between them shifted, no longer uncertain, no longer fragile. It held. She lifted her hand slightly again, the cloth at her wrist catching the light, and then she did something small, something that might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. She pressed the fabric once, gently, against her palm, as if acknowledging it, not for what it was, but for what it meant. Elias felt the memory of that cloth rise in his mind, not as an image, but as a feeling. Years ago, another morning, another kind of light. A different pair of hands folding it, smoothing it out with care, before placing it in his. He did not close his eyes, but the past stood close enough to touch. When he looked back at her, something had changed. Not in her. In him. Behind her, one of the older men in the line shifted forward a half step, enough to draw the eye without breaking formation. His hair was threaded with gray, his posture straight but not rigid, his presence carrying a weight that did not need to be declared. He did not look at Elias immediately. Instead, he looked at the girl, at the cloth, and then finally, slowly, he turned his gaze toward the rancher. Their eyes met across the space between them, and in that moment, there was no distance at all. The man inclined his head, not deeply, not ceremonially, but with a quiet acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any grand gesture could have. Elias responded the only way he knew how. He returned the nod. Nothing more, nothing less. The exchange lasted no more than a breath, but it settled something into place that had been waiting long before either of them had arrived at this moment. Behind Elias, the men from town shifted again, their unease now unmistakable. One of them spoke under his breath, too low to carry, but enough to break whatever confidence he had brought with him. Another pulled lightly on his reins, turning his horse just a few degrees toward the road, testing the idea of leaving without committing to it. No one stopped them. No one even looked their way. That was what made it harder. The absence of attention weighed more than any challenge could have. Elias took a slow breath, the air filling his chest with the scent of dust and sun-warmed grass, and turned slightly toward his gate. He walked to it without hurry, each step deliberate, the same way he had walked all his life. When he reached it, he placed his hand on the top rail, feeling the worn grooves left by years of use. For a moment, he simply stood there. Then, with a gentle motion, he pushed it open. The hinges gave their familiar protest, a soft, drawn-out sound that seemed louder than it should have in the quiet. He stepped back, leaving the gate open behind him. An invitation, though he did not frame it that way in his mind. Just a simple act. The girl watched him, her expression unchanged, but her posture softened, almost imperceptibly. The older man beside her glanced once at the open gate, then back toward the horizon. No one moved to cross it. Not one step forward. Not one step closer. The line held, not as a barrier, as a promise. Elias rested his hand on the gate for a moment longer, then let it fall to his side. He understood now, in the quiet way a man understands things that do not need explaining. They were not here to take anything. They were here to stand, to watch, to guard something that had no name but had been given shape by a simple act the day before. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint rustle of cloth and leather, brushing past the open gate, through the line of still figures, and across the land that no longer felt quite so empty. And somewhere behind him, without needing to look, Elias knew the men from town were already turning their horses back toward the road, leaving in the same silence they had found, carrying with them something they would never quite be able to explain. The morning settled into something steady, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but held, like a hand resting firm on a shoulder without needing to press. Elias Boone remained by the open gate, the wood warm now beneath the rising sun, his shadow stretching long behind him toward the house he had built with hands that remembered more than his mind cared to revisit. The line beyond the fence did not shift, but it did not need to. Their presence had already said what it came to say. The land itself seemed to recognize it, the wind moving slower, the distant hills standing in a silence that felt almost respectful. Elias turned slightly, glancing back toward his porch, toward the chair by the window, toward the life he had lived alone for so many years that even the idea of company felt unfamiliar. Then he looked forward again, back to the figures beyond the fence, and something in him chose to remain where he stood. Not out of uncertainty, out of understanding that moments like this did not ask to be rushed past. The girl moved first, not toward him, not across the gate, but along the line, her steps measured, her posture calm. She stopped beside the older man again, speaking to him in a voice too soft to carry across the distance, but the tone was clear enough. It held respect. It held certainty. The older man listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving the horizon until she finished. Then he gave a slight nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had offered Elias before, and shifted his stance just enough to signal something that did not need words. One by one, almost imperceptibly, the line adjusted. Not breaking, not dispersing, just settling into a new shape, a wider arc that extended farther along the edge of Elias's land, as if the boundary they guarded had grown without anyone marking it. Elias watched this without moving, his breath slow, his eyes steady. He understood now that what he was seeing was not a reaction to him alone. It was a response to something larger, something that had been set into motion by a simple act that had asked for nothing in return. Behind him, faint and distant, the sound of hooves began to fade, the men from town choosing distance over questions they did not know how to ask. Their presence slipped away like the last trace of laughter carried off by the wind, leaving behind only the quiet weight of what had replaced it. Elias stepped forward once, then stopped again at the open gate, his hand brushing lightly against the top rail. He did not close it. He did not need to. The space between him and those beyond it no longer felt like a line that separated. It felt like something shared. The girl turned her head slightly, catching his movement, and for the first time since dawn, there was the faintest shift in her expression. Not a smile. Something quieter. Recognition. She raised her hand again, the cloth at her wrist moving with the motion, and this time she held it there for a moment longer, letting the sunlight rest on the worn fabric, on the stitching that had endured years without meaning to anyone but him. Elias felt his chest tighten, not with pain, but with the weight of memory settling into the present. He did not step closer. He did not call out. He simply lifted his own hand, just slightly, mirroring the gesture without fully understanding why. It was enough. The girl lowered her hand, and the moment passed, but it did not disappear. It remained, woven into the quiet that now filled the space between them. The older man shifted again, his gaze moving briefly toward Elias, then back to the horizon, as if acknowledging that what needed to be understood already had been. Time moved on, as it always did, but slower here, stretched thin across the land like the long shadows that still lingered at the edges of the morning. Elias took a breath, deep and steady, and turned back toward his house. Not to leave the moment behind, but to carry it with him. He walked a few steps, then paused, looking over his shoulder one last time. They were still there, every one of them, unmoved, unshaken, watching the land as if it mattered, as if it belonged not to ownership, but to something earned through quiet acts no one had thought to notice before. Elias nodded once, to no one in particular, and continued toward the porch. The boards creaked under his weight as he stepped up, the familiar sound grounding him again in the life he knew. He reached for the door, then stopped, leaving it open instead, the same way he had left the gate. Inside, the lantern still burned low, its light faint now against the strength of the day. Elias moved to the table and rested his hand near the folded cloth that remained, his fingers hovering just above it before finally settling down. For a moment, He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to let the quiet settle fully inside him. Outside, beyond the open door, the line held. The wind moved gently through it, carrying no fear, no threat, only the steady presence of something that had chosen to stand where it did, without asking for permission and without needing to explain. And in that stillness, Elias Boone understood something he had not felt in a long time. Not loneliness, not even peace. Something deeper. Something that did not come from being seen, but from being understood without a single word spoken. By mid-morning, the sun stood high enough to burn the softness out of the land, turning every shadow sharp and every detail clear, yet the stillness remained unbroken, as if whatever had taken root at Elias Boone's fence had decided it would not be hurried by daylight. Inside the cabin, the air had warmed, carrying the scent of old wood and dust, but Elias did not stay long within those walls. Something about the open door behind him and the quiet beyond it made staying inside feel like turning his back on a conversation that had not yet ended. He stepped out again, slower this time, not searching, not questioning, just returning to a place his feet now seemed to understand without needing direction. The porch boards creaked under him, then fell silent as he reached the edge and looked out once more. They were still there. Not a man had left. Not a stance had broken. The arc they had formed along his land now felt less like a line and more like a presence that had settled into the shape of the earth itself. Elias walked down the steps and crossed the yard, stopping again at the open gate, though this time he did not hesitate. He leaned lightly against the post, arms resting, posture easy, like a man who had accepted something without needing to name it. Beyond the fence, a small shift caught his eye. The girl moved again, but not along the line this time. She stepped toward the gate, slow and deliberate, each foot placed with care, as if respecting not the ground beneath her, but the space between them. She stopped just short of crossing, her eyes lifting to meet his, steady and clear in the full light of day. Up close, he could see more now. The dust along her sleeves, the faint lines of wear in her clothing, the quiet strength in the way she stood without leaning or wavering. The cloth remained tied at her wrist, its faded threads catching the sunlight in a way that made it stand out against everything else she wore. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the distance between them no more than a few feet, but still held by something neither of them chose to break. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, careful, shaped by words that did not come easily in his language, but carried meaning all the same. "My father," she said, pausing just long enough to make sure the words were right. "He says the man who gives when he is little sees more than most." The sentence was not perfect, but it did not need to be. Elias listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, though something in his eyes shifted, a quiet recognition of something deeper than the words themselves. She continued, her voice gaining a touch of steadiness as she spoke. "He says what you gave was not food." She lifted her hand slightly, the cloth moving with it. It was memory. The word lingered in the air between them, simple and heavy at the same time. Elias let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh, not quite anything else, and nodded once. "Maybe," he said, his voice low, worn by years but steady as ever. "It was just something I had." The girl studied him for a moment, as if weighing that answer against something she already knew. Then she shook her head, just slightly. "No," she said, softer now, "you chose." The words settled differently. It did not accuse. It did not praise. It simply stated something that had been seen clearly from where she stood. Elias did not answer right away. He looked past her for a moment, out toward the land, toward the line of figures that still held their quiet watch, then back at her again. "Out here," he said slowly, "most folks think choosing only matters when it is hard." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "Sometimes it matters more when it is easy not to." She listened, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture softened, as if the space between them had shifted again, becoming less guarded, more understood. Behind her, the older man watched, not stepping forward, not interrupting, but present in a way that made it clear this moment was seen by more than just the two of them. The wind moved lightly across the open land, brushing against the fence, lifting the edge of the cloth at her wrist, carrying with it the quiet weight of everything that had been set into motion by a single, simple act. The girl lowered her hand slowly, letting the fabric rest again, and gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, but something closer to what Elias had given earlier. Recognition. Then she stepped back, returning to her place along the line without turning away completely, her eyes lingering on him for just a moment longer before shifting outward again, joining the others in their watch. Elias remained by the gate, his hand resting once more on the worn wood, his gaze moving across the land that no longer felt as empty as it had the day before. The silence returned, but it was not the same silence he had lived with for years. This one carried something within it, something shared, something chosen. And as the sun climbed higher, casting its full light across the ranch, Elias Boone stood there without moving, understanding that whatever had come to his gate that morning was not something that would pass quickly, and not something that needed to. The sun reached its highest point and settled there, pressing its weight down across the land, flattening shadows and pulling every hidden detail into the open, yet nothing about the line beyond Elias Boone's fence gave way under that light. If anything, it made their presence clearer, sharper, undeniable in a way that no early morning haze could soften. Elias remained near the gate, though now he had moved just enough to sit on the top rail, one boot resting on the lower beam, his posture relaxed in a way that would have seemed impossible the day before. He was not guarding anything. He was not waiting for anything. He was simply there, part of a moment that had stretched longer than expected and yet did not feel like it was asking to end. Beyond him, the figures held their positions, but small movements had begun to ripple through the line. A shift of weight, a turn of the head, a quiet exchange between two men that did not carry across the distance. Not restlessness, adjustment, like men settling into a long watch they had already decided to keep. Elias noticed something else now. The way they were spaced was not random. The gaps between them were measured, consistent, as if each man understood exactly where he needed to stand without being told. It was not military. It was something older, something learned over time, shaped by land and necessity rather than command. His gaze drifted again to the girl, Ayanna, who stood near the center of the arc, her presence anchoring the line in a way that did not need to be announced. She had not moved far since stepping back, but there was a difference now. The tension that had once lived in her shoulders was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that matched the quiet certainty of those around her. The cloth at her wrist shifted slightly in the breeze, catching the sunlight in brief flashes that drew the eye without demanding it. Elias watched that movement longer than he intended, not because of the fabric itself, but because of what it carried with it. Memory, she had said. He turned that word over in his mind, not as a thought, but as a feeling. Memory was not something a man could hand to another. Not really. But maybe it could be recognized when it appeared, even in the smallest form. A sound drifted from the direction of town again, faint but distinct. Not laughter this time. Something quieter. Wheels on dirt. A wagon, slow-moving, cautious. Elias did not turn right away. He had learned that not everything approaching needed to be met head-on. But eventually, he shifted his gaze, just enough to see the outline forming along the road. A single wagon, pulled by one horse, moving at a pace that suggested uncertainty more than purpose. It slowed as it neared the edge of his land, stopping well short of the riders from earlier, as if whatever courage had brought it this far had already begun to thin. A man climbed down from the seat, his movements careful, his posture not quite steady. Elias recognized him after a moment. Thomas Reed, storekeeper, not a loud man, not one of the ones who had laughed the day before, but he had been there, watching, saying nothing, which, out here, sometimes meant the same thing. Thomas did not approach the gate. He did not call out. Instead, he walked a few steps forward and stopped, removing his hat slowly, holding it in both hands as if unsure what to do with them otherwise. His eyes moved from Elias to the line beyond the fence, lingering there longer than they should have, taking in what he had likely never expected to see this close to town. Then, without a word, he reached into the wagon and pulled out a small crate. He carried it forward, each step deliberate, until he reached a point just outside the boundary of Elias's land. There he set it down, not pushing it forward, not pulling it back, just placing it where it could be seen. He stepped away from it immediately, backing up a pace, then another, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again, this time toward Elias. Their eyes met for only a second, long enough to understand. not long enough to make it something more. Elias did not move. He did not step forward to take the crate. He did not acknowledge it with words or gestures. He simply watched. After a moment, Thomas placed his hat back on his head, turned without hurry, and walked back to the wagon. He climbed up, took the reins, and guided the horse around, heading back toward town without looking over his shoulder. The crate remained where it had been set, unclaimed, unmoved. The line beyond the fence did not react. No one stepped forward. No one turned to look. Their attention remained fixed outward, as it had from the beginning, as if what happened within the space behind them was not their purpose to question. Elias finally pushed himself up from the gate, stepping down onto the dirt with a soft thud. He looked at the crate, then at the road where the wagon had disappeared, then back to the line. He understood something now that had not been clear before. What had begun as a single act was no longer his alone. It had moved beyond him, taken shape in ways he could not have planned, could not have asked for. He walked slowly toward the crate, stopping just short of it, his hands at his sides, his posture unchanged. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he turned his head slightly, glancing once more toward Ayanna. She saw him. Of course she did. And for a brief moment, the smallest shift crossed her face. Not surprise. Not expectation. Something closer to approval, though it did not settle long enough to be certain. Then it was gone, and she returned her gaze to the horizon. Elias looked back at the crate, then out across the land, and let out a quiet breath that carried more weight than sound. The wind moved again, brushing past him, past the crate, past the open gate, carrying with it the quiet understanding that what stood here now was not just a moment. It was a change, and like most changes worth anything out here, it had come without noise, without force, and without asking anyone if they were ready for it. The crate sat in the dirt where it had been placed, its edges catching the midday light, casting a small, sharp shadow that seemed far too heavy for something so ordinary. Elias Boone stood over it for a long moment without moving, his eyes tracing its shape as if it might tell him something before he ever touched it. The wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of sun-baked earth across the yard, brushing lightly against his coat, against the open gate behind him, against the silent line that still held steady beyond the fence. Nothing pressed him to act. Nothing rushed him. That was what made the moment different from anything he had known before. Out here, decisions were usually driven by necessity. Water, weather, survival. But this was not that. This was something quieter, something that waited. Elias bent slowly, his joints reminding him of years he no longer counted, and placed one hand on the top of the crate. The wood was warm from the sun, rough beneath his palm, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with what it contained. He did not open it right away. Instead, he rested his hand there, feeling the stillness around him, as if the land itself was watching what he would choose next. After a breath, then another, he lifted the lid. Inside were simple things. A sack of flour, tightly tied. A small bundle of dried beans. A tin of coffee, its label worn but still legible. Nothing extravagant. Nothing rare. But not nothing, either. Elias looked at the items without expression, though something in his gaze deepened, a quiet recognition of what it meant for a man like Thomas Reed to leave something like this behind without a word. Not charity. Not trade. Something else. Something learned, perhaps, in the space between yesterday and today. Elias closed the lid gently, not out of disinterest, but out of respect, as if the act of opening it once had been enough to understand it fully. He straightened, slower this time, and turned his head slightly toward the fence. The line remained unchanged. The men stood as they had before, their attention still fixed outward, their presence steady, unwavering. They had not come for the crate. They had not come for anything that could be placed in a box or carried in a sack. Elias understood that now with a clarity that settled deep in his chest. He reached down again, this time gripping the side of the crate, lifting it with a measured effort. It was not heavy, but it carried weight all the same. He turned and walked back toward the porch, each step deliberate, the boards creaking softly as he stepped up and set the crate just inside the doorway, leaving the door open behind him. He did not take it further in. Not yet. It did not belong hidden away. Not after the way it had been given. Elias stepped back outside, closing the distance between himself and the gate once more, though this time he did not stop at the fence. He walked along it, slow and steady, his hand brushing lightly against the top rail as he moved, following the line without crossing it. As he walked, he passed closer to the figures beyond, close enough now to see more than just their silhouettes. The details became clearer, the stitching in their clothing, the way their boots met the ground, the quiet steadiness in their eyes that did not shift toward him even as he moved within their sight. This was not distance built from fear. It was distance chosen with purpose. Elias stopped when he came opposite Ayana again. She did not turn immediately, but she knew he was there. That much was certain. After a moment, she shifted her gaze toward him, meeting his eyes with the same calm certainty she had carried since morning. He did not speak right away. Words had never been his first choice, and today they felt even less necessary than usual. Still, after a moment, he nodded once toward the house, toward the open door where the crate now sat just inside. "Not just me anymore," he said quietly, his voice low but clear in the still air. It was not a question. It was not a statement meant to explain, just an acknowledgement of something that had already taken shape. Ayana followed his gaze briefly, her eyes resting on the open doorway, then returning to him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, softly, she answered, "It never was." The words settled between them, simple and complete. Elias held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, the kind that closed a conversation without ending it. He turned and walked back along the fence, returning to the gate, where he rested his hand once more on the worn wood. The land stretched out beyond, unchanged and yet not the same as it had been the day before. Behind him, the crate sat inside the doorway, a quiet presence that did not ask to be explained. Beyond the fence, the line held, not as a wall, not as a threat, but as something steadier, something chosen. The wind moved again, carrying no sound but its own, brushing past the open gate, through the silent figures, across the wide, open land that now held more than it had before. And Elias Boone stood there, between what had been given and what had been returned, understanding that neither belonged to him alone anymore, and that was exactly why it mattered. The afternoon stretched long across the land, the kind of slow, unbroken time that gave a man space to notice things he might otherwise miss, and Elias Boone noticed more now than he had in years. Not because anything loud had changed, but because everything quiet had settled into place. The line beyond his fence still held, though the sun had shifted enough to pull shadows back into existence, stretching them behind each man like silent companions that moved without asking. Elias stood by the gate, one hand resting loosely on the worn wood, his posture easy but attentive, like a man who had stopped expecting trouble but had not forgotten how to recognize it. The crate remained inside the doorway, untouched since he had set it down, its presence lingering in his mind the same way the girl's words had, not as something that needed to be acted on immediately, but as something that would not be ignored. The wind carried a different sound now, faint at first, then clearer as it rolled across the open land. More wheels, more hooves, not fast, not urgent, careful. Elias turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the road that led back to town. This time, it was not just one wagon. Two, maybe three, spaced apart, each moving at a distance from the other as if the people guiding them had not planned this together, but had arrived at the same decision on their own. The first wagon slowed long before it reached the edge of his land, stopping even farther back than Thomas Reed had earlier. A woman climbed down, her movements hesitant, her hands smoothing the front of her dress in a way that suggested she did not quite know where to place them. Elias recognized her after a moment. Mrs. Carter, widow, lived near the well at the edge of town. She did not look toward the line right away. Instead, she looked at Elias, then down at the ground, then back toward the wagon as if confirming to herself that she had come this far and could not turn back now. She reached into the back and pulled out a small basket, covered with a cloth. She held it carefully, both hands steady despite the uncertainty in her posture, and walked forward, each step measured, stopping well short of the gate, leaving a distance that mirrored the one Thomas had kept before her. She placed the basket on the ground, gently, as if setting it down too hard might change what it meant. Then she stepped back, her eyes lifting briefly toward Elias, not seeking approval, not asking permission, just acknowledging his presence the same way one might acknowledge a witness to something that mattered. Elias did not move. He did not nod. He simply watched, his gaze steady, his silence matching hers. Behind her, the second wagon had come to a stop. A younger man climbed down, his movements quicker but no less uncertain, carrying a sack over his shoulder. He hesitated, glancing once toward the line beyond the fence, then quickly away, as if the weight of those silent figures pressed harder than anything he carried. Still, he walked forward, stopping beside the basket, setting the sack down next to it without a word. He did not look at Elias at all, not out of disrespect, but out of something closer to humility, as if meeting the rancher's eyes would require more than he was ready to give. One by one, the pattern continued. Not a crowd, not a gathering. Individuals, each arriving alone, each bringing something small, something simple, something that carried more meaning than value. A jar, a bundle, a sack. They placed them near the edge of Elias's land, never crossing the boundary, never stepping closer than the space allowed. No one spoke, no one explained, and still, everything was understood. Elias remained where he was, the open gate behind him, the quiet line before him, and now this growing collection of offerings settling into the dirt between. He felt something shift again, deeper this time, not in the land, not in the people, but in the space that connected them. This was no longer about one man's choice. It had become something shared, something that had taken hold in others without needing to be named. His eyes moved to Ayanna once more. She had not stepped forward this time. She remained where she stood, watching not the people from town, not the items being placed, but the horizon beyond, as if her role in this moment was not to witness what had come, but to hold steady what had already been set into motion. Yet, after a moment, she turned her head slightly, just enough to see what had gathered near the gate. Her gaze lingered there, taking in the quiet accumulation, then shifted back to Elias. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a calm acknowledgement, as if this had been expected in a way that did not need to be explained. Elias let out a slow breath, the sound barely audible, and looked out across the land once more. The wind moved gently, carrying the scent of flour, coffee, dried goods, mixing with dust and sun and something else that had no name but was felt all the same. The laughter from the day before was gone now, not replaced by noise, but by something quieter, something that asked for nothing and yet changed everything. Elias Boone stood there, between the open gate and the growing line of small offerings, between the silent watch of those who had come without asking and the quiet steps of those who now followed without being told. And for the first time in a long while, the distance between people felt smaller than the land between them. The light began to soften as the afternoon leaned toward evening, stretching the shadows long once more across the land. And with it came a shift that was quieter than anything that had happened so far, but no less certain. The small offerings near the edge of Elias Boone's land had grown, not into a pile, not into anything disorderly, but into a careful arrangement that spoke of intention rather than impulse. Each item had been placed with space around it, as if whoever had brought it understood that meaning did not come from how much was given, but from how it was offered. Elias stood by the gate, watching this without moving, his eyes taking in not just what had been left behind, but how it had been left. The basket from Mrs. Carter now rested beside the sack from the younger man, the crate inside his doorway still untouched, forming a quiet line that mirrored, in its own way, the one beyond the fence. The sun dipped lower, and for the first time since morning, something changed among the figures standing watch. It was not sudden, it was not announced, but it was there. One of the men at the far end of the arc shifted his stance and stepped back, just a single step, then turned slightly, his posture no longer fixed toward the horizon, but angled toward the others. Another followed, then another, the movement passing through the line not like a break, but like a signal understood without words. Elias straightened slightly, his hand leaving the gate as he watched the shift unfold. The line did not collapse. It did not disappear. It transformed. The men began to move, not toward him, not away in retreat, but along the edge of the land, their steps slow, deliberate, as if marking something invisible that had now been set in place. Ayanna remained where she was for a moment longer, her figure still against the fading light, the cloth at her wrist catching the last warmth of the sun. Then she stepped forward, just once, and turned toward the older man beside her. He spoke quietly, his voice too low to carry, But the weight of it was clear in the way the others paused, in the way the movement settled into something final. Elias felt it then, not in his eyes, not in his ears, in his chest. The understanding that what had come had reached its end, not because it had run out, but because it had fulfilled what it had arrived to do. Ayanna turned back toward him. This time, she did not stop at the line. She walked forward, crossing the space she had held all day, stopping just short of the open gate. The distance between them was smaller now, but it still held, not out of caution, but out of respect for something that had been built between them over the course of a single day. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the first hint of evening with it, brushing against the land in a way that felt like a quiet closing of something that had begun at dawn. She looked at him, her gaze steady, the same calm certainty present, but now carrying something else. Completion. My father says, she began, her voice soft but clear, a gift that is seen does not belong to one person anymore. She paused, letting the words settle, her eyes not leaving his. It belongs to the land that remembers it. Elias listened, his expression unchanged, but his eyes held something deeper now, something that had shifted beyond recognition into understanding. He nodded once, slowly. Land's got a long memory, he said, his voice low, worn but steady. Longer than most men. Ayanna inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth in that without needing to say it. Behind her, the movement continued, the line dissolving not into absence, but into direction, the men walking along the edge of the land, fading slowly into the distance from which they had come, their presence lifting from the ground without leaving it empty. She turned slightly, glancing once over her shoulder, then back at Elias. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly between them, carrying no urgency, no weight, just the quiet understanding that had replaced everything else. Then, with a final, small gesture, she untied the cloth from her wrist. The fabric moved freely in her hand now, no longer bound, no longer held in place. She stepped forward just enough to reach the top rail of the gate and placed it there, gently, as if returning something that had never truly left. Elias did not reach for it right away. He simply watched as she let go, her fingers releasing the worn fabric, leaving it resting on the wood between them. It remembers you, she said quietly. Not as a question, not as a promise, just a truth spoken without weight. Then she stepped back, turning without hesitation, her figure moving away from the gate, returning to the others, who now continued their quiet departure across the land. Elias stood there as the last of them moved into the distance, their shapes growing smaller against the fading light until they became part of the horizon itself. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was fuller. He reached out then, slowly, and picked up the cloth from the gate, his fingers closing around it with a care that had not changed, only deepened. The sun dipped lower, casting the ranch in long, quiet shadows once more, and Elias Boone stood alone again. But not the same as he had been. The sun slipped lower until it touched the edge of the world, dragging light with it in long golden strands that stretched across the land before fading into something softer, something quieter, and Elias Boone stood at the gate long after the last figure had disappeared into the horizon, his hands still holding the cloth, his eyes fixed on the place where they had been as if the land itself might speak if he waited long enough. But it did not. It simply remained, wide and still, the same as it had always been, and yet not the same at all. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It carried something now, something that stayed even after footsteps faded and voices were gone. Elias lowered his gaze slowly, looking at the cloth in his hand, turning it once between his fingers, feeling the worn edges, the softened threads, the faint imprint of years that had never truly left it. For a moment, he said nothing, did nothing, just stood there with the weight of it resting in his palm. Then, with the same quiet care he had always shown it, he folded it once. Then again, smaller now, more deliberate, before slipping it into his coat pocket. Not to hide it, just to keep it close. The air cooled further as the light thinned, the first hint of night settling in along the edges of the land, and Elias finally stepped away from the gate, turning back toward the house. The porch creaked beneath his boots as he climbed the steps, the familiar sound grounding him again, but it did not feel like a return to what had been. It felt like stepping into something that had shifted, even if nothing visible had changed. The crate sat just inside the doorway, the lid still closed, the basket and the sacks resting where they had been placed near the edge of his land, untouched, unclaimed in the usual sense, yet no longer belonging to no one. Elias paused at the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes moving from the crate to the fading light outside, then back again. Slowly, he stepped inside and moved toward the table, setting his hat down with care before turning back to the crate. He crouched beside it, lifting the lid once more, not because he needed to see what was inside, but because the act itself felt like part of something that had not yet fully settled. The flour, the beans, the coffee, simple things, but they did not feel small anymore. He reached in, lifting the tin of coffee first, turning it in his hands, feeling the cool metal against his fingers. He set it on the table, then the sack of beans, then the flour, placing each item down with the same quiet intention that had marked everything that had happened that day. Not hurried, not uncertain, just steady. Outside, the wind moved gently through the yard, brushing past the open door, carrying with it the faint echo of something that had already passed but had not disappeared. Elias straightened slowly, his back stiff, his breath measured, and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time in years. Nothing had changed. The chair by the window, the lantern on the table, the worn floor beneath his feet. And yet, something had shifted in the way the space held him. He moved to the window and looked out. The land stretched wide, the last light fading from the hills, the fence line visible in silhouette against the darkening sky. There was no one there now. No figures, no movement, just the open land. But it did not feel empty. Not anymore. Elias rested his hand against the window frame, his fingers tapping once, lightly, as if marking something only he could feel. Behind him, the items on the table remained where he had placed them, quiet and still, waiting for nothing, needing no explanation. He turned away from the window and moved toward the door again, stepping back out onto the porch as the first stars began to show faintly in the sky above. The air had cooled enough now to carry a different kind of stillness, one that belonged to night rather than day. Elias walked to the edge of the porch and stood there, looking out across the land once more, his posture relaxed, his breath slow. The gate remained open. He noticed that now, more clearly than before. He had not closed it, not out of forgetfulness, out of choice. He let his gaze rest there for a moment, then nodded once, to no one, to everything, and turned back toward the door. Inside, the lantern waited, its flame low but steady, and Elias Boone stepped into the quiet of his home, carrying with him something that would not fade with the light, something that did not need to be seen to remain. The night settled fully over the land, not sudden, not heavy, but gradual, like a blanket laid down with care, covering everything without disturbing it. And Elias Boone sat by the window with the lantern casting a low, steady glow across the room, the small circle of light holding back the dark just enough to make the space feel contained but not confined. Outside, the open gate stood where he had left it, a quiet shape against the deeper shadows of the yard, and beyond it, the land stretched wide and unseen, carrying the memory of the day in a way that did not require eyes to witness it. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze not fixed on any one thing, but moving slowly, as if tracing something that no longer needed to be followed step by step. The items on the table remained untouched since he had set them down, the tin of coffee catching the lantern light in a dull reflection, the sack of beans and the flour sitting beside it with a quiet weight that spoke of more than sustenance. They were not just provisions. They were decisions. He understood that now, not all at once, not in words, but in the way the feeling settled into him, deeper than thought. The wind moved faintly outside, brushing against the walls, slipping through the small gaps in the wood, carrying with it the distant sounds of night settling into its own rhythm. No voices, no movement close by, just the quiet presence of a world that had not changed and yet had shifted in ways that would not be undone by morning. Elias reached into his coat pocket slowly, his fingers finding the folded cloth without searching, drawing it out with the same care he had shown every time he had touched it. He unfolded it once, then again, letting it rest across his palm, the worn fabric soft against his skin, the stitching still holding despite the years it had carried. He looked at it for a long moment, not remembering anything specific, not calling back any single moment, but feeling all of it at once, the weight of time, the choices made without knowing what they would become, the quiet acts that had seemed small when they were done and had grown into something far larger than the man who had done them. He placed the cloth gently on the table beside the coffee tin, smoothing it once with his hand, not to fix it, but to acknowledge it. Outside, the night deepened, the sky filling slowly with stars that stretched across the horizon, silent and distant, yet constant in a way that felt familiar. Elias stood after a while, the movement unhurried, his body adjusting to the change with the ease of someone who had long ago learned not to fight the passing of time. He moved to the door and stepped out onto the porch, the cooler air meeting him with a softness that belonged only to night. He paused there, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes lifting toward the sky before lowering again to the land before him. The gate remained open. He saw that again. It had not changed. It had not needed to. He stepped down from the porch and walked a few paces toward it, stopping where he had stood so many times that day, though now the space felt different. Not watched. Not guarded. Held. The absence of the line beyond the fence did not leave a void. It left a presence that lingered in the shape of the land, in the way the silence rested instead of pressing. Elias reached out and placed his hand on the top rail of the gate, his fingers tracing the worn grooves, the familiar texture grounding him in something that had always been there, and yet had never meant quite what it did now. He did not close it. He understood why without needing to explain it. Some things, once opened, were not meant to be shut again. He stood there for a while, the time unmeasured, the quiet uninterrupted, until the night settled fully into itself and the land held steady beneath the sky. Then, slowly, he turned back toward the house, his steps soft against the dirt, the porch creaking once more as he climbed it, the door still open, the lantern still burning low inside. He paused at the threshold, looking in at the table, at the cloth, at the small collection of items that now filled the space with something more than their presence. Then he stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him, the night air moving gently through the room, carrying with it the quiet understanding that what had passed through this place had not left it, and what had begun here would not end with the turning of a single day. Morning returned the way it always did out on that stretch of land, slow and without ceremony, the first light spilling over the horizon in thin lines that stretched across the fields before settling into something steady, something honest. Elias Boone was already awake when it came, not because he had slept poorly, but because something in him no longer needed the full weight of night to rest. He sat at the table, the lantern burned out now, replaced by the pale glow of dawn slipping through the open door and window, touching the edges of the room in quiet, deliberate ways. The cloth lay where he had left it, beside the coffee tin, beside the small gathering of things that had come without being asked, and for a moment, he simply looked at them, not counting, not measuring, just seeing. Outside, the air held that early chill that never lasted long, carrying with it the scent of dust and dry grass and something else that had no name but felt familiar now, like a place remembered rather than discovered. Elias stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked toward the door, stepping out onto the porch as the sun began to lift itself fully into view. The land stretched wide before him, unchanged in shape, unchanged in color, but not unchanged in meaning. The fence line stood where it always had, the gate still open, its angle catching the morning light in a way that made it seem less like a boundary and more like a gesture that had not yet finished being made. Elias stepped down from the porch and walked toward it, his boots pressing lightly into the dirt, leaving marks that would not last beyond the day. When he reached the gate, he rested his hand on the top rail, the wood cool now, the grooves familiar beneath his fingers. He did not close it. He had already decided that without needing to think it through. Instead, he pushed it just slightly, not to shut it, but to straighten it, to let it stand where it had been meant to stand all along, open but steady. The movement was small, but it settled something in him, something that had been waiting since the moment he first left it that way. He stood there for a while, looking out across the land, his eyes tracing the horizon where the figures had once stood, where the memory of them still rested, not as shapes, but as something carried in the space itself. Behind him, the house remained open, the door wide, the table holding what had been given, not as offerings, not as debts, but as signs of something that had taken root without anyone naming it. A sound came from the road again, soft and distant, the slow approach of a single rider. Elias did not turn right away. He had learned that not every arrival needed to be met with urgency. When he did look, he saw a young boy, no more than 12, riding carefully, his posture straight but unsure, as if he had practiced the path in his mind before ever setting foot on it. The boy stopped a good distance away, sliding off the horse with care, his boots hitting the ground softly. He held something in his hands, small, wrapped in cloth, and for a moment, he stood there, looking at Elias, then at the open gate, then back again. There was no fear in his eyes, only hesitation, the kind that comes from wanting to do something right. He walked forward slowly, each step measured, stopping just outside the gate, not crossing, not assuming, just standing where he understood he should. Elias watched him, his expression calm, his posture unchanged, giving the boy the same space that had been given to him the day before. The boy looked down at what he held, then back up, and after a moment, he stepped closer, just enough to reach the gate. He placed the small bundle on the top rail, the same place the cloth had rested the evening before, his hands careful, respectful, then stepped back immediately, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again. He did not speak. He did not need to. Elias looked at the bundle, then at the boy, then back at the land, letting the moment settle the way all the others had. After a breath, he reached out and picked it up, feeling its weight, light but certain, and nodded once, not to thank, not to dismiss, but to acknowledge what had been done. The boy's shoulders eased slightly at that, just enough to show that the moment had found its place. Then he turned, climbing back onto his horse, guiding it gently back toward the road without looking back. Elias remained at the gate, the bundle in his hand, the morning stretching out before him, the land wide and open, the silence no longer empty, but full in a way that did not need to be explained. He stood there as the sun rose higher, as the light filled every corner of the space he had known for years, and for the first time, it did not feel like he was standing alone within it. The gate remained open. The door behind him remained open. And somewhere between those two simple things, something had changed that would not be undone, not by time, not by distance, not by the quiet return of ordinary days. Out here, far from towns and noise and the need to prove anything to anyone, it was enough. And that was more than most men ever learned to recognize.